Yep.
Kind of hard to see.
Okay.
So this is our simulator. As you can see, it's a entirely immersive simulator. So we've got screens that wrap all the way around here.
Yep.
The flow car. So we'll have subjects come in. They'll sit in here, and it drives pretty much like a real car does. So if you want to hop in, you can.
No, I just look
Sure.
first.
In here we've got, in addition to all the normal controls, you can see all the cameras we have up on the dashboard here. Those are so we can track where people are looking.
Oh,
So
okay.
as people sit in the car, we can tell where they're looking at here using these cameras here. So it's a completely non-immersive tracking system. We've also got ways that we can make people do different tasks in here so they can respond via button press.
Okay.
We actually have some voice recognition software in there, so oftentimes we'll have people do what we call information processing tasks. So remembering lists of words, things like that, things that are supposed to kind of simulate what it's like to do like a cell phone conversation. And we can have them respond in various ways there. So the nice thing about simulators is that we can put people in situations that we couldn't put them in the real world.
Sorry, I'm getting very scared. Like, it's very realistic.
It is. People get. We have people scream and everything all the time in here when they're about to hit things. So we can put people in really dangerous situations. So we can make things kind of jump out at people.
Okay.
So you can see this truck, which will kind of cut me off.
Oh.
And we can make situations that respond to what the driver is doing. So that car will actually vary its speed to kind of intercept where I'm about to enter in the roadway. We're also able to get, the other nice thing about simulators is that we can get a variety of different performance measures. So we can collect all sorts of information about how I'm manipulating the vehicle. So when I'm pressing the brake, how much I'm accelerating. We can get measures of the other vehicles, so we can record where those cars are. So all sorts of really useful information that we couldn't really get in a non-road setting.
I see.
My background's in psychology, so I did my undergrad here, and I'm a grad student now, senior grad student, fifth-year grad student now, in what we call the Visual Cognition and Human Performance Division. So I study kind of selective attention and divided attention in real-world environments. So my expertise is on how people drive when they're distracted, and in particular how older adults deal with distraction and divide their attention, and kind of comparing young and old adults, seeing how attention changes over the lifespan.
I see. So,
kind of across the aging literature that not all older adults are kind of created equal. So there's a wide variety of abilities among older adults, and a wide variety of kind of levels of functioning. So we know that falls are a major issue for older adults. Once older adults fall, they have some pretty bad outcomes typically. It's kind of hard for them to recover from that. And there's this idea in the literature that falls are, while we often think of falls as being kind of this physical thing, there's a strong kind of mental aspect to falls and falls risk. So people, and it kind of comes down to the ability to divide attention. So when we think about walking, the ability to walk is not just kind of this automatic thing, especially for older people who often have balance issues. They kind of have to pay more attention to the walking task. So people who are likely to fall often have deficits in the ability to divide attention, what we call executive function, so kind of planning out tasks, managing competing tasks at the same time. So what we did with the driving was we got a bunch of older adults, we screened them for falls risk, so we measured like how well they could maintain balance, how well they could respond quickly to certain tasks. And then we ran them through a battery of driving tasks, and we found that people who scored lower on this measure of falls risk, or higher, more likely to fall, performed worse, were slower to respond in our driving simulator. And we actually correlated performance on measures of divided attention, so simple computer-based measures of divided attention, how well people can do two tasks at the same time. We correlated that with driving performance and falls risk as well. So we think there's this kind of underlying relationship between the ability to do multiple things and performance on real-world tasks. Absolutely. So the following task is kind of the classic task in the driving literature. So there, it's a very simple task, a very controlled task. So there, people are following, there's a car out in front of the driver, just a single car. And we ask the driver to follow that car, maintain a certain distance, and from time to time that car will slam on its brakes. What we do is we just ask people to respond as quickly as possible when they notice that braking. What was I forget the other task.
Hazard task.
The hazard task. So the hazard task is more similar to what you do as you're driving around like a busy college campus. So there we have people driving through a busy urban scene with lots of other vehicles, lots of pedestrians, some parked cars.
Okay.
And from time to time we have things kind of pop out at the drivers. So we have people, pedestrians stepping out in the road. You can imagine college kids kind of jumping out from behind cars. We had bike riders crossing the road, cars pulling out from parked spots. And we see, again, how fast people can respond to those sorts of events.
I see.
And in both cases, I think our fallers responded slower than our non-fallers. And that relationship, again, was predicted relatively well by measures of executive function, so how well people could do complex tasks.
So if
Attention just generally is kind of our ability to attend to certain things in our environment, so it kind of allows us to take information into our systems and in some way manipulate that information, act on that information. So selective attention refers to just our ability to select out certain things that we want to attend to. So if I'm driving through an environment, I have to select out things that I think might be potential hazards, so cars that look like they're ready to pull out. I kind of have to move my attention around, and this idea of selective attention. Dual task cost refers to instances where we're trying to do more than one thing at once. So we know that humans are relatively poor at doing multiple things at the same time. So our selective attention allows us to select one thing, but we're relatively bad at selecting more than one thing at once and responding to more than one thing at once. So you can imagine when you're driving through an environment trying to select out cars, but you're also kind of paying attention to a cell phone conversation or looking down to send a text message. So we're really bad. We kind of have a limited amount of attention that we can spread around, and when we try to spread that attention around too much, we get what's called dual task costs. And those are just costs to performance of doing two tasks relative to performing each task separately. So if I were to drive and talk on a cell phone, it would be the costs to either of those tasks versus just driving or just talking on a cell phone.
Okay, so
I mean, generally the difference that we find, and not just in driving, but in all of the complex tasks that we look at, is that older adults tend to really struggle when we ask them to do complex tasks and more than one task at the same time. So when we have older adults talk on a cell phone, it's much more distracting to older adults, there's much more impairment in performance for older adults compared to younger adults. So older adults, it's generally thought that older adults have kind of more limited attention, fewer attentional resources to kind of spread around between these two tasks. So oftentimes older adults will be able to perform simple tasks just as well, but really struggle when we ask them to perform a complex task or perform two tasks at the same time.
explain it.
So change detection is just our ability to notice significant changes in our environment. So the likelihood that if I'm driving down a street, I'll notice a car pulling out from a parking spot, or I'll notice a pedestrian stepping out into the world. We know that in general, people are worse at detecting changes than they think they are. So oftentimes we think we're likely to notice major changes in our environment, and we really often miss those sorts of changes. Older adults tend to be more susceptible to that than young adults. So it kind of boils down again to differences in kind of the amount of attention that older adults have. So older adults are more easily distracted by cell phone conversations or doing other tasks. So they're more likely to miss these sorts of big changes in environments. Salience just refers to like how noticeable things are in an environment. So if you're driving along, say at night, and you see a really bright light, it's a very salient thing. Whereas if you're driving along and the car didn't have its lights on, it would be much less salient, much less noticeable. So that salience helps us in terms of being able to detect changes, and the ability to detect those changes is, again, kind of a function of age, as well as a number of other attentional factors. Yeah. I mean, the level of distraction in terms of other sorts of technologies like cell phones and texting really boils down to kind of our level of engagement with those technologies. So people have done studies where they've had people listen to the radio and compared that to people talking on a cell phone. And listening to the radio oftentimes doesn't have much of an effect on driving. So you can think of listening to the radio as kind of this passive activity where you're not really keeping that information too much in mind. Whereas talking on a cell phone, you're much more engaged in the cell phone conversation. You kind of have to think about what was said, kind of generate responses. So it's a much more engaging activity. So you can kind of think of it as the more we have to devote attention to an activity, the more likely that activity is to distract us from missing big changes in our environments. Sometimes we can, in terms of redundant signals, we can kind of trigger people's attention to a certain area. So if we wanted to get drivers to look ahead at the roadway, we can say if we had some kind of a collision monitoring system or something like that. We can provide signals that are helpful in alerting people's attention. So we can provide visual signals. We can have a flashing light on the dashboard, or auditory signals, some sort of localized sound for responding to those things. Having redundant signals allows us to, it kind of strengthens the likelihood that people are going to notice those things. So if, say, they didn't notice the visual signal but they heard the sound, it kind of boosts the chance that they're going to notice a certain signal. And people have used those kind of warnings effectively. John Lee at Wisconsin and others have kind of created these warning systems, and actually now are kind of creating ways to detect driver distractions, so they can use eye tracking measures like we have in the car to detect when drivers are looking away from the road, and then give them those kind of warning signals to kind of bring their attention back to the driving task. A variety of things from a psychological standpoint. I mean, a number of those things haven't been kind of thoroughly tested yet, but what we know about distraction is that it doesn't, it's not necessarily an issue of taking your eyes away from the road. So when we compare, say, hands-free and handheld cell phone conversations, there's no difference in terms of how distracting those sorts of activities are. A group at Utah just looked at kind of those hands-free entertainment systems and found them to be similarly distracting to handheld and hands-free cell phone conversations. So really the issue lies in kind of limitations in our brain, so we can only process so much information at any given time. Kind of the nature of that information, if it's engaging information, it's going to distract us, even if it's not, even if it's not visual information. So people have tried to provide, I know a little bit of research has tried to use similar to like the visual cues for collision warning systems. People have used tactile cues, which may or not provide localization information. So people have vibrated the steering wheel or vibrated the seat when there's some sort of warning. To a large extent, that kind of the efficacy of those systems depends on our ability to kind of depends on our familiarity with those systems. So a lot of times people aren't as familiar with kind of the steering wheel rumbling. There's not kind of this direct mapping between the steering wheel rumbling and responding to something out in the world as there would be like a flashing light or a sound. Whether people can grow more accustomed to those things is still kind of an open question. I'd like to think that they would. So tactile warnings certainly overcome some of the limitations of visual warnings or sound warnings. So you can think of sound warnings. It's not always going to be a really quiet environment. Visual warnings, you don't necessarily want to move people's eyes away from the road. So I think there's a lot of promise in those technologies. Let's see. So there has been a little bit of training, especially in terms of older adults. We can kind of retrain strategies for looking around the road. In terms of kind of redirecting older adults' attention, I mean, there's been some work done here with those sort of collision warning systems.
Okay.
And older drivers are actually able to utilize those warning systems as well as young adults.
I see.
And what's thought there is that older adults have a lot of experience, way more experience than you or I driving. So they're able to kind of utilize, they're much more experienced driving, so they're able to utilize those warnings even though they have kind of baseline deficits in attentional abilities. So they're kind of able to utilize their experience. So those sorts of warning systems have been shown to be somewhat efficacious, at least for older adults. So visual warnings or auditory warnings, and especially redundant sorts of warning systems.
Could you explain, you brought this concept of mapping, could you explain it better?
Sure, so mapping is just kind of creating this relationship between two different stimuli. So in the context of driving and some kind of warning system, it's just referring to we have this warning system out there, but we need to kind of create some relationship between that warning system and what's happening in the real world environment. So if I see a visual light out in front, and there's always a car kind of cutting me off when I see that visual light, I'm going to create this relationship in my mind between those two things, which allows me then, once I've created this relationship, to kind of quickly respond to the event in the real world based on the stimulus inside the car. So right now, we're looking into, I know we're looking into some brain measures. So we're looking at EEG, which is just a measure of electrical recording from our scalps. So as we think about things, kind of the electricity in our brains changes, creating different distributions in our scalps. We're using that to kind of predict when people start to have lapses in attention. So if they start to, say, fall asleep or start to think about something other than driving, we can see if we can predict that sort of those sorts of activities using different physiological measures.
I see.
Let's see, so things like heart rate and pupil dilation, kind of basic physiological measures of alertness or attention, those sorts of things have been used and could certainly probably be incorporated more into vehicles and kind of these smart vehicles. Things like eye tracking are more and more being kind of implemented in vehicles and not actually in real vehicles now. So all these kind of different ways to measure attention, measure kind of where our attention's allocated in these sorts of complex environments.
I see. So more active systems.
Yeah, so the idea is to kind of have the car be kind of incorporated with the driver, kind of have the driver and the car kind of work together.
I see.
Cars that can kind of aid drivers, kind of notice things that drivers might miss, kind of reorient drivers' attention. Notice when drivers are distracted or sleepy.
I see. Very interesting concept there. It almost reminds me of like Avatar, where the guy like plunks himself into the.
And it's more and more we're seeing things like that, seeing research like that.